Hey guys, I just wanted to make a quick video as I've had a few more days to think through Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Also had the privilege of watching The Passion of the Christ, and I wanted to speak on that really briefly. It's actually a lot more biblically accurate than I would have imagined. Of course, it's a movie and they take liberties to over-dramatize certain scenes and aspects, but I think with good intention, to really capture things. I'm thinking of maybe the depiction of Satan and the devil. And of course, there's things they miss or things they embellish. That's with any movie, but for the most part, there's lots of details that I found really interesting. But with that being said, I want you to think about the garden, and particularly the cup of God's wrath, as I would understand it, that Jesus drank in the Garden of Gethsemane. One of the things, this actually came up in a conversation with my father-in-law, but we're talking about how many pastors tend to project this passage solely on Jesus as being depicted as a fear of death, and Jesus wrestling to the point of even sweating blood. And many pastors point that Jesus is only fearing his death and try to project and amplify his humanity in this aspect. And I think we do a disservice in missing that there's more than just that going on. While at the same time, I don't want to pretend like that wasn't a factor. Jesus did clearly know he was going to die. If you've been watching the Mark series, this is something that Jesus talks about repeatedly, not only the form of death and that he is going to die, but also what is to happen 3 days later, specifically pinpointing the date of his resurrection, but also the way in which he'll engage with the apostles after his resurrection. And so, for instance, saying that he would precede them going to Galilee. So I think that in summary, we should say Jesus was drinking down the wrath of God, and that's what was in the cup that God the Father was giving to the Son. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think Jesus, in summary, is not only wrestling with the gravity of a couple things. So let's keep a couple things in mind. To be sure, it's not only Jesus' fear of death. I think he's very aware that Satan wishes to sift and has desired to sift the disciples. I think Jesus is anxious over that. I think Jesus as well is grappling with the fact, something else that I've been thinking about, and I want you to consider, God for all of eternity past has never had any kind of sin laid upon him in any shape or form. He's been wholly blameless, utterly faultless, utterly without any hint or touch or temptation of or thought of evil that arises from within himself. And so it is no small thing for Jesus to bear the weight of sin on his shoulders. And this is something that God is taking on, Jesus the God-man, he's taking on in a way that has never happened in human history. This is a moment that is one of a kind, and is never to happen most likely in the future. And so this is an extremely unique moment, and I cannot venture to say all that was going on. I said to my father-in-law the other day, I wish I could strap on some spiritual goggles and see all that took place. We do know, according to the Gospel of Luke, there was an angel who came to minister to Jesus. It says he strengthened him. There's been many commentators to speak to this, Paul Washer, Frank Turek. I watched things said by John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, a lot. Any notable sermon, Leonard Ravenhill, I could go on and on. I try to watch and see just how anybody is depicting it or capturing it. And while I don't feel that I understand it all completely, I will say that what was going on was more than just a human element. It was more than just a fear of death. It was Jesus, I believe, and to the best of my understanding, I think protesting or not protesting, there is nothing but cohesion and unity of vision within the Trinity. So what we need to say as Orthodox Christians, and I think what we see here, it's not fully explained to us, so that's why I think we wrestle to capture it. when he's saying, Father, let this cup pass from me, but not to my will, but yours be done. I think he truly is asking if there's another way for this to take place, but I don't think, here's where I'll draw my personal distinction. I don't think it's because he fears death. I think it's because he fears something along the lines of him taking on sin. And I think knowing that the nature and character of God is utterly holy and blameless, this is something repulsive to him. And so I do think there's a genuine protesting. I read one article and I actually read a book on this topic these past few days. And one of the articles said that maybe Jesus, in the sense that he said, Father, let this cup pass from me. And he referenced Judaism in their ritual partaking of the Passover to say that once someone drained the cup, then they would pass it. To say that Jesus is saying, let this cup pass from me, therefore let me drain this cup. I couldn't find that anywhere. It sounds great. It helps with my Trinitarian theology for God to be cohesive and on the same page. But nevertheless, I'm just not so sure that's what it means. It seems to be a genuine protest, and it does say in the text that Jesus was sorrowful unto death. His soul was sad to the point of death. And so I do think he was wishing to humbly and submissively and obediently ask the Father, as only a child can, if there was another way. I do think that was taking place. But what I think his motivations is where we get it wrong most often. I don't think his motivation is in a preservation of his life. He's been predicting his death and resurrection his whole life, and God in the Trinity has been projecting this all the way back to Genesis in the garden where this very thing was prophesied. So I don't think Jesus is trying to bypass that. I think what he's trying to bypass is that he is about to take on not only the wrath of God, but also the sin of the world. And these two things together are the most weighty things. Every sin for all of human history to be laid upon his shoulders. And at first, my conception concerning his sweating of blood, I said, well, maybe he was taking it on in the garden, and that's why he's sweating blood, because he literally cannot carry the spiritual weight of what's going on. But then I was reading through the different gospel accounts, and when Peter chops off one of the ears, Jesus rebukes him, and he actually says this. He says, Peter, am I not to drink the cup that my Father has for me? In other sense, what he was essentially saying is that the cup that the Father has for me is before me. I have not yet taken it, but will you try to prevent this? And then he confronts him and says, look, I could call down legions of angels. No one takes my life. I lay it down freely. So what I'm saying is that in the garden, what's taking place with the sweating of blood, it is the bursting of capillaries. He is hemorrhaging internally and beginning to sweat blood out of severe stress and anxiety. But to be sure, I think back of reading Fox's Book of Martyrs, as Christians would willingly go to their death all throughout human history. I don't think I would say that Jesus is weaker than the rest of humankind, or that his tapping into the empowerment of the Holy Spirit is any less than Christians have experienced for the past 2,000 years. Rather, what I would say is that Jesus wasn't only being put to death, but he was experiencing the full weight of the wrath of God. And I don't understand that in the complexity and completeness of its sin, but he was. I can say that much. The other thing, again, as already mentioned, he's not only absorbing all of the wrath of the Father, but also all of the sin and the guilt and the shame, I believe, of humanity's sin. And I believe the best way I know now to explain that is not something that takes place in the garden, but something, and I think we see overlap with this in Isaiah 53. There's something in that the scourging of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus was in some sense, literally him embodying the punishment of God upon himself. And as he hung there for multiple hours, in some sense, he was absorbing the condemnation of mankind, and in some sense was paying for all of our sin. And so I believe, to state bluntly and clearly, the cup, what Jesus was drinking, he was gulping down the wrath of God to its fullest extent. But his anxiety, the sweating of blood, the severe fervency of his desperation as he falls on the ground and he's repeatedly praying throughout the night. I don't think this is in protesting of his death. I think it's in his protesting of literally to absorb the wrath of the Father and to absorb the sins of mankind for all of human history. This is no small thing for God to do. For him to take on sin, someone who has been blameless for eternity past, all he's known as holiness. Not only was it magnificent for the Son, the second member of the Trinity, to take on human flesh, but even in his human flesh, he's experienced the sufferings of sin, but he's never experienced the weight of sin, the penalty of sin, in the sense that he had never carried any sin. He never sinned in and of himself. So I think there's something that takes place. Again, I don't think this takes place in the garden. I believe this is embodied in the physical torture and crucifixion of Christ. I think that's the best way to understand it. Again, this is why he doesn't partake of the third and fourth Hallel cup during the Passover as he converts it to the Last Supper. He converts Passover to, I'm blanking here. It'll hit me. Hold on. Communion. There it is. I caught it. But as he's doing that, I think once we bring all these things together, I think that's a better understanding. So think about these things, pray about these things. If you have some pushback or maybe you have some different perspective, maybe something has led you to believe differently, I'd love to hear it in the comment section down below. But I think that's how I'd best understand the cup. The contents of it seems pretty clear based on Old Testament theology of the cup of God's wrath and various passages that speak to that. But as far as the atonement and the theory of atonement, and not only the theory of atonement, but the theory of understanding Jesus as the substitutionary lamb, I think that's the best way I know how to understand it. And so I think, well, there is something to be said about Jesus' physical suffering in the garden before his torturing and crucifixion, because again, an angel had to show up to strengthen him. So in some sense, he seems like he wouldn't have had the strength of his own to do it unless he was ministered to by an angel, which echoes back to Elijah and other characters. I think that the brunt of God's wrath is best understood as the human beatings, the human scourging, the human crucifixion is in some way, and again, I don't understand this perfectly. This is probably one of the most complex sections I found in the Bible concerning the life of Christ. What I think in some way, shape, or form that the human sufferings of Christ in some way overlaps with God's hatred of sin, in some way overlaps God's punishment of sin on the Son, and again, death and punishment being given to one, which can then be extended to all, as Romans 5 speaks to. So love to hear your thoughts. I hope this was a blessing, me frustratingly pulling my brain apart as I tried my best to interpret this rightly. And I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on this. Bless you, and I hope to see you for Mark chapter 15.